Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Gaming. If you are under the age of 18 or the subject of sex is a bad one for you, let's say, skip this video because I don't know where it's going to go. It's going to be a meandering video. There's a few reasons for that, one of which is it is unscripted, as all my videos are. I never know where they're going to go. And also, it was requested as such. So, as many of you know, I make videos by request, and the tradition is if you buy one of my RPGs, get in touch with me via MatthewDawkins.com and you request a video. What I've been doing for the last few months is if you pick up a hard copy of The World Below, the link is below, you can buy it from DriveThruRPG or back a kit if you want a traditionally printed copy. Buy a hard copy of The World Below, get in touch with me via MatthewDawkins.com, my website, there's a contact button on there, and request a video of your choosing. That is open to you, the viewer, right now, if there is a video subject you want covered. And that is what Steve did. So I don't know Steve, other than the fact that Steve is someone who picked up a copy of The World Below. Thank you very much, Steve. I really do appreciate it. And off the back of picking up The World Below, sent me an email that says, and there were a few emails, but this is where it started. The email says, Matthew, I picked up a copy of The World Below. It just arrived. It looks epic. That's very nice of you, Steve. Thank you very much. I would love to see a video on sex in RPGs. And that's where the email ended, until I responded and said, that's excellent, Steve. It's a really interesting topic. Can you narrow down what you want discussed about it? Because it's also an incredibly broad topic. And Steve and I went back and forth a few times, and that's why, Steve, if you're watching this, and I certainly hope you are, this video's taken a bit of a while to make because you purchased the game about a month ago and we've been going back and forth for about a month trying to narrow down exactly what you want to discuss. And we concluded about a week ago with you saying, just make a video in your usual meandering way, which I think was you throwing your hands in the air and saying, look, I'm done with this. So apologies, Steve, that we never quite narrowed down what you wanted mentioned, discussed, or addressed, or what have you. So meandering is what you get. We will have a meandering video with no particular direction, no notes, no script. Sex and RPGs, well, sex in all walks of life is a contextual thing, isn't it? When is it appropriate, when is it not? It's appropriate within the correct context. You never just want to thrust it in without warning, which is the only innuendo I'll make in this video with any luck. And that is sex in general. Sex in RPGs, no different. Let's say you're running a game of Numenera, your characters decide they're going to meet with the, I don't know, the Patriarch of Chin, or Chi, I think it is, and you open his door and you find out that he is having his cock sucked by 3 sex workers simultaneously. They're all nanos, so I guess in Numenera they would be, what is it, an adjective, noun, who, verb, so it would be a talented nano who fillets. There we go. If none of that had been built up, and if you're running for a group of 12 to 16-year-olds, you're probably in for some trouble. You shouldn't have done that. That was inappropriate. Bad use of sex. The thing is, I've encountered a lot of role players, and this is the traditional argument when talking about sex in RPGs, is you have a 60-plus-year-old man, usually with a beard and a bit of a gut, and he says, I don't want to pretend I'm having sex with Arthur over the other side of the table. I don't want to tell him how I want to lick his, and so on. And the thing is, that is the argument that often comes up if you talk about sex in RPGs. It is almost always, in my experience, and this is all purely anecdotal, I've done no research, you will get people who are very scared of being put in a position where they have to act out a sex act with another player. And that is very rarely what sex in RPGs ever actually amounts to. It's interesting that that's where the mind immediately goes. Whether it's D&D, vampire, bloody cyberpunk, or anything, you get people who are scared of the process rather than mentioning it, I think is fair to say. Which is why a lot of people, if sex appears in an RPG, will immediately go to the fade to black or cut to black and say it happened, and let's move on. It's one of those interesting phenomena, I suppose. Not that sex is much of a phenomenon unless you do it really well. That violence is always far more palatable than sex. D&D is a game with the premise of which is violence. You kill things, you level up. Now, that has changed a great deal over time, but generally speaking, games have a lot of conflict in that. Conflict tends to be resolved with violence, but sex isn't quite so happily on the table, so to speak. I'm really doing badly with the innuendos, but we'll carry on. I'm not deliberately walking into them. They just happen to be there, and I fall onto them while hoovering naked. Now, all of that said, I understand why a lot of people are sensitive about sex, especially in North America, where it is a subject that is still treated hugely as taboo. In Europe now, and we're not all that enlightened in Europe, it's not like this is the green and pleasant land on the other side of the Atlantic. But we have plenty of, to use an example, teen dramas that handle sex in a deep and meaningful and interesting way, gloves off, without a church or political group or lobbyists coming in and saying, you can't broadcast that. That doesn't happen anymore. We had our video nasty era, but oddly it was more focused on violence than sex. We had plenty of porn going on back then, but it was the violence that was really clamped down on. The opposite in America, I guess, as far as conservative sensibilities are concerned. So it's understandable that a lot of people don't want to address it if you're looking at this through the lens of media and what you grow up with as normal. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't appear in RPGs. I've written a lot of role-playing games, whether it be for Vampire, for Cult Divinity Lost especially, where sex is a mainstay of the game. Those games are very sexual. Now, Vampire is a very interesting one because for a while it moved strongly away from that, especially in the revised era where vampires were kind of portrayed as cold, emotionless machines. Sorry, excuse me. I forgot to breathe while I was talking. And then that was all put back in again, doubly so for 5th edition. In Cult Divinity Lost, you have monsters that are basically predicated around sex. They are sexually predatory demons, for want of a better term. And what I've always found when writing those scenarios is it makes perfect sense to write them that way, because sex can be titillating and it can be terrifying. It can be just as much a part of the horror tapestry as disembowelment, as torture, as pulling someone's nails out, whatever. I'm not suggesting that's how sex should be. But it can be just as much a part of violence, and it can also be part of romance and health and companionship and finding solace in a traumatic situation. And that's often how it's placed in Cult Divinity Lost. You get both sides of a very hot-button issue. And what's interesting to me, and I'll often use the word interesting in this video, I expect, is whenever I run Cult, and I think I learned this when I used to play Cult all the way back to like 1999 or 2000 when I first played it, because I played Cult before I played World of Darkness. The GM, even back then, this was before safety guidelines, checklists, X cards, and so on, would always say to us in advance, this game's going to contain sex and it's going to contain violence, and sometimes the two are going to meet in the middle. If your character is ever at threat of either, but especially that hybrid, you can nope out at any time and we will find a way out of the scene. Got that? And that was basically the discussion. And people should do whatever they are comfortable with, whether they need a checklist, an X card, or to run through their lines and veils and so forth. I think that's all fantastic. You should do whatever works for your table. But it showed to me that the idea of safety checks isn't anything new. Being mature, being responsible, being sensitive to your players' desires and their hard limits and so on has been a part of gaming, theatre, basically play since time immemorial. I have no doubt. You could probably go back to D&D in 1970 whatever and have a group say, you know what, I'm not comfortable with child sacrifice being in this adventure, Gary. And Gary Gygax saying, okay, well, you won't have it being children being sacrificed, we'll have it be adults. And the player probably said, that's fine. Who cares about adults being ritually slaughtered? So, you know, these things are context specific, and that's why I come back to sex being a contextual thing in RPGs. There are times when it's appropriate, there's times when it's inappropriate, but that appropriateness is going to vary from group to group, from player to player, from story guide to story guide, and so on and so forth. There is no ideal way to do it, except to be mature and responsible about it. Now, I say this having made mistakes in the past. Certainly, I remember when I ran Hunt of the Vigil at the UK Games Expo many, many years ago, and one of the villains was a sexual predator, basically. And I made I didn't conceal his actions, what he had been doing to his victims. In fact, I probably relished the shock that the players went through. The thing was, beforehand, I had described the game as being 18 plus, will contain scenes of sexual violence. I remember I'd done that, but I never addressed it at the table until it happened. And so there's every possibility someone might have missed the disclaimer, someone might have gone away horrified. Luckily they didn't. They all came back the year after to play the third part of that chronicle. But that is a place where I have subsequently grown a little, and I've realised, okay, you don't just spring that on people anymore, and I shouldn't have done so back then either. So it's again, I use that word interesting because quite unexpected to me in a way that surprised me. I was running Call of Cthulhu not that long ago. It was just after lockdown for a group of 3 people that had hired me in person to travel to them to run a weekend-long Horror on the Orient Express, starting on a Friday, ending on a Sunday, getting as far as we could and to do it again another time. And so there was this Airbnb rented. I brought all the props along and everything like that. It was basically like hosting a murder mystery, which I'd been paid to run. And to my great surprise, for the very first time in a Call of Cthulhu game, I had not only in players who wanted to play investigators who wanted to ultimately become cultists, but players who were incredibly sexually liberated with their investigators, to the point that when they were playing through the Paris part of Horror on the Orient Express, they went down to the Paris catacombs and were pretty much violating each other, defiling each other and NPCs in what became something of an orgy in the catacombs. And I remember at the time when I was running it, thinking, okay, all right, I'm going, that's fine. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't horrified. I wasn't titillated. I just rolled with it because it was my job. And then a couple of weeks later, someone asked, so how did that go? And at that point, I realised I just kind of sat there and watched while 3 players went through some kind of sacrificial orgy in the Paris catacombs in really lurid detail. And I never signed up for that. And it's rare that it gets turned around on the keeper in this case, that you become witness to players doing things that you didn't expect. But I imagine it happens plenty of times. I've certainly read of cases where a player has wanted their character to do something unseemly, to put it mildly, to an NPC, and the GM thinks, what? Where did that come from? So these things can happen. The subject we'll keep coming back to is sex being contextual, because you put it in the right place. Here we go again. I remember when I was LARPing, and I've LARPed less than a dozen times, fewer than a dozen times in my life, and I don't intend to ever go back to it. And I'm not painting all LARPers with the same brush by any means, but I realised it wasn't for me. Because the sheer number, more than half of the LARPs I have participated in, I have encountered at least one player who is using a position of dominance to get off. And the reason people are well aware at this point of my dislike for the La Sombra in Vampire the Masquerade is because I've tended to find it's people playing La Sombra who do that. I'm not saying all La Sombra, I'm not saying all players who play La Sombra, but I've found that the La Sombra enable a certain kind of play. And I remember at the convention of Thorns LARP, a big luxury LARP that took place in Poland, I don't think it's going anymore, and there was a player as a La Sombra who was using his Dominate to make a player drop to their knees very close to his belt level, where he would feed them from his wrist in an act that basically simulated fellatio. And he was, without doubt, well, I say without doubt, without my doubt, living out a kink. He was doing this to get off. He was, and in fact, based on discussions that happened after that LARP, apparently this is something he always does. Doesn't matter the game, he will get someone to drop to their knees and go through this feeding act. And I remember being witness to it. I wasn't a focus on that scene. I was passing through and I saw this, and at first I thought, oh, okay, so they're playing out a sort of sire-child or domitor-ghoul relationship. And I was there for long enough to realize this person is really abusing their position of power as a player, not just as a character. And what was weird or unsettling to me, and is still confusing to me, is where you draw the line. Not do you draw the line on someone mentally masturbating while they play a vampire, but specifically regarding in this case, the submissive to his dominant. Because my understanding a few weeks later, when we were all discussing the game quite happily, was she was completely unaware that he does this every single game. This is basically his thing. And she was left very confused by this. Because she enjoyed playing it. She enjoyed playing the ghoul character and thought it was a great scene. And the people who were stood around witnessing it, goading her into doing it, some of them were aware that there was a sexual element, some of them weren't. And so what came out of it is a feeling of, in her case, I've been violated, but I wasn't aware I was being violated, if that makes sense. And when I became aware that this kind of thing happens in quite a few LARPs, certainly there were a few LARPs I attended where there was at least one or two creeps who would basically be living out their kinks through their character. I guess the definition of bleed, but not the usual trauma-based bleed. In a way, it's I am going to play out the kind of fetishes I have by building a character that has 4 points of dominate and a couple of points of potence, so I can really force you down. It left me unsettled to the degree that I didn't want to do this anymore. I didn't want to participate in this because it felt like I was basically enabling it by not intervening on it. And the nobler action, I'm not suggesting this is in any way heroic, the nobler action, I guess, would be to say, no, stop, and be some kind of watchman or moderator or storyteller, enforcer or whatever, to prevent this kind of thing from happening. But I realize that scene isn't for me. There's enough people who are happy with it, and ultimately it is the job of the people who are dedicated to that lifestyle to enforce it, not me. I'm just passing through, which again I admit is not a heroic thing to do, but that's where I was. It's the only time in a role-playing game I have felt like there's some kind of that the line has really been crossed. Now, on the other hand, you can have sex in an RPG be absolutely appropriate, it can be magical, it can be fantastic. And that can still end in a fade to black. Or it can have a certain amount of detail. And detail doesn't need to be lurid for it to be sexual. In a game not all that long ago, I was running, and one of the players, and we discussed beforehand, it was a game of Pendragon, in fact. I discussed beforehand that her character, so she is playing a knight, Sir Christian, And Sir Christian is actually a young woman posing as a man. And Prince Madoc, the bastard son of King Uther, unbeknownst to her, he has been basically sent to live with her to learn the ways of the knight, because he's a complete rabble-rousing maniac, and Uther wants him brought to heel, and he doesn't have the time himself, so he sent him to a more responsible knight, Sir Christian in this case. Madoc was sent to dwell with Sir Christian, and Madoc ended up sliding into Sir Christian's tent one night, under the assumption that Sir Christian was a man, because Prince Madoc is gay or bisexual in this game. We don't know. But point is, he wanted to have sex with Sir Christian. And there was description of what he was trying to do. I checked with the player in advance. The player was fine with this. And it went to a certain... there was a certain amount of clinical description of what he was doing. And there was a certain amount of romantic description. And I think that is an important blend, at least when I'm describing these things, to actually talk about what he is doing physically and what he is conveying emotionally. And so you can talk about how he is holding his throbbing member in his hand, if you want it to sound like vintage erotica, but you can also say that he is breathing heavily, he lightly kisses you on the shoulder, and he whispers in your ear, and he sounds like he is at peace, he sounds like he is happy at this moment. And of course, given the scenario, he then realised that Sir Christian isn't exactly who he thought he would be, and he was shocked and appalled and didn't realise what he was about to do, and so on. And the, I guess, comedy of errors followed. But it wasn't comedy. It turned out, in its weird way, romantic, sadly romantic. We have to see where that campaign goes. Ultimately, it was a sex scene that was spoken about before the game was ran, and we played through it. And there was an audience, the other players, and it was handled in a way that was both consensual, but not aiming to turn anyone on at the table. That wasn't the objective. It could have just as easily been handled with a couple of sentences of Prince Madoc slides into your tent and tries to have sex with you. Then he's shocked to discover you're not who he thinks he is. But this scene required more intimacy, in my view, and the players, and so that's why we played through it. Again, context is king. You speak with the players, you get their consent, their buy-in, if you like, and then you can always check as you're going through it to make sure they're still happy with this, and then you can cut to black when you're comfortable. Or they can. Basically give everyone access to the off switch, so that the lights can go out when they don't want them on anymore. It is... You asked for a meandering video, Steve. This is a meandering video and a half. I will tell you that. When it comes to subjects like, I don't know, sexual violence, when talking about games like Cult Divinity Lost, that's something where I tend to, as a GM, if it gets to a point where the violence needs to be described in intimate detail, it isn't something you play through, necessarily. You can make rolls in advance, potentially, to see if it's something your character wants to escape, for example. And then you choose whether you want it to cut to black again. Hell, if you don't want it to go ahead, you can say. Or if you want it described. And I mentioned broad strokes before. Kind of terminology I have used in the past is that you feel the demon invading you. Every orifice feels like it is being stretched to the point of splitting. There is not a part of you that is not being consumed by the demon right now, and yet you are simultaneously consuming it as you feel it burrowing up into your... and so forth. You're not doing that with the intent, again, to drive someone away or to titillate them. You're doing it to express the horror of the situation. Now, sometimes that isn't going to be what players want. Sometimes that's not going to be what I want. And as soon as someone doesn't want it, you don't do it. It's not that complicated. And when people complain to say, oh, you know, people are too sensitive, people are too weak, or you know, how are we supposed to play these scenes out if someone doesn't want it described? All I can really tell you at that point is this is a collaborative medium. We're supposed to be mature and respectful of each other. And if you don't want it, if someone doesn't want it, you apply that context to the real world as well, or indeed any media you're watching, and you either don't do it, you switch off, you walk the other way. It should be no different than an RPG. And honestly, despite the fact some people would argue that, I don't think I've ever in my life, and that does not say it doesn't happen, I don't think I've ever in my life encountered a situation where a player has said, I don't want to go on with this, and the other player said, well, we've got to. I've already written it. It sounds like the kind of thing that could happen, but it's not something personally I have witnessed. But as mentioned with the LARP and various other games, I've certainly witnessed things I didn't expect or may have been inappropriate, depending on the situation, the circumstance. The bottom line on all of this is obviously consent. It's consent, it's maturity, it's knowing what you've signed up for, but it's also knowing that you can back out at any time. And yes, I know that is a good piece of advice for sex in the real world as well as sex in RPGs, but it's something you should take to heart if you want to keep your players around and if you respect them and if you want them to respect you. Because to go back to that first innuendo in the video, you don't thrust it in without warning. It's no one ends up happy in that situation. Everyone ends up very upset, and I don't think, or confused. And that goes back to that point about the LARP. For me, the confusion is the most troubling thing, because I think often in those cases when a player has just been through something, as when I ran that game of Call of Cthulhu in a way and didn't know what was about to happen and witnessed it and took a while to process exactly what I had been participant or party to, because occasionally they wanted me to dictate what they were rolling and things like that, and so it wasn't like I was just passive in observing that. It's the delayed reaction to something that I don't know that I would call it trauma. Some people would, but I guess shock is fair. And sex in media can be shocking. Sex can be titillating. Sex can be enjoyable. It can be romantic. It can be a great high point to a plot, to a narrative. Hell, if you've got characters in a party, or you've got a really important NPC and a character falls in love with them and they have sex, and whether you describe it or not, or whether you cut to black, or whether you end up skipping ahead a couple of weeks and have the two of them holding down the hand with a lovely fuzzy glow around their cheeks to imply what they've been up to, that use of sex can be narratively, it can be narrative dynamite. It can be fantastic, but you can cross the line, you can breach the threshold, you can call it what you like, you can abuse the trust of others if you misuse it. So, Steve, meandering video that this has been, my recommendation to you if you're going to use it in your game is check with the players. Check with the players, and knowing that you are a World of Darkness fan, to finalize on the subject of vampire. I mentioned Revised Edition very much puts vampires in a cold, aloof, sex is a tool and nothing more bracket, which isn't how they necessarily were at the start of 2nd edition, definitely isn't how they are in 5th edition, and 20th anniversary definitely has more sex in it than Revised. In my view, as a storyteller, as a writer, I don't see why vampires wouldn't be sexual, and I don't see why characters in any RPG wouldn't be sexual, because people do have sex for more reasons than simple procreation. I think where people really got hung up on vampire was the idea that the only satisfaction a vampire can take, or the greatest pleasure a vampire can take, is through blood, which is still true. But to say that they wouldn't have sex because blood is their main driving force is like saying, I won't eat pork because steak tastes better. Sometimes steak isn't available to me, and anyway, I prefer roast pork. It's a facile argument, in my view. I think that as long as a vampire has any kind of connection to humanity, they are likely to still want the same kind of feelings of sensation, of companionship, of love that come through having sex, but also the loss that can follow. It is a way of deepening a relationship, and that means if, as inevitably does happen in World of Darkness games, your partner is then destroyed, injured, whatever, you now have an even deeper bond with them than you would have if all you had done was hold hands and watch some movies. Not every character has to be sexual, and it is quite possible to have characters who are asexual, who are not interested in these things at all, but obviously the subject of the matter is for the characters who are. It gets a little more nuanced, I suppose, when you have characters who are very low humanity, who might follow a path of enlightenment, someone who, a monster, essentially, who may not even think of sex at that point, other than as a tool, other than as a weapon. And that's when you start looking at books like Montreal by Night, which, despite its flaws, it has a very interesting set of highly sexualized characters, including in the art, infamously, and they're not doing it out of compassion or because there's any kind of good, wholesome love on display. It's because they know, even as monsters, that sex can be a powerful tool to use over somebody, and that they can manipulate people with it. And so, yeah, just because a character like Mithras is thousands upon thousands of years a vampire doesn't mean that he's not necessarily going to want to occasionally satisfy himself in other ways, in sexual ways, because he still has the same brain. He still has the same memories. He can still develop affections. He can still develop companionships. Do I believe he should be in some monogamous relationship with Roger de Camden? No. I think Mithras is probably, and never was, just down the line gay or straight. I think at some point in his history he realised he can take pleasure from any number of sources, hence the relationship with Kementiri as well, if we're really getting into the lore weeds. But when people complain that Mithras wouldn't do this because of his relationship with Kementiri, well, you've not actually seen a full list of his sexual partners, and that list doesn't exist, so make him as you want him in your game. It really has no difference on the greater meta plot who he has had sex with in his past. Anyway, long video, meandering as requested, Steve, and I hope this has been to your satisfaction one way or the other. And if anybody watching this has any views on this subject, please comment below. And if anyone watching this wants a video of your own, meandering or otherwise, pick up a hard copy of The World Below and contact me through MatthewDawkins.com. Make your request, and we will hopefully be able to narrow down the subject you want me to discuss. Thank you very much for watching, and be seeing you.